Earth more than 4 billion years ago is often imagined as a nightmare. Asteroids hammer the surface, entire regions melt, oceans repeatedly boil away. Any early environment suitable for life is destroyed before it can remain stable for long, but almost none of the rocks from that world still exist. Now, scientists have used machine learning on some of the oldest surviving minerals on Earth and found something that should have been there if this violent picture were correct. It was missing. The researchers analyzed ancient zircon crystals from rocks more than 3.2 billion years old. They trained an artificial intelligence model to recognize zircons produced inside enormous sheets of rock melted by asteroid impacts. When the model examined the ancient grains, it found no convincing evidence that they formed from continental impact melt sheets. The researchers argue that this is consistent with a lower early impact flux and a potentially more habitable Hadean Earth than some bombardment scenarios suggest. That conclusion begins with crystals smaller than grains of sand. Zircon is unusually valuable because it can survive processes that destroy most other minerals. Rocks containing zircon can erode, become sediment, be buried, heated, and transformed, while some zircon grains preserve chemical information inherited from the magma in which they originally crystallized. Some terrestrial zircons are more than 4 billion years old. In a world where almost all rocks from Earth's first several hundred million years have vanished through erosion, melting, and geological recycling, these crystals provide rare surviving evidence of conditions on the young planet. The period before 4 billion years ago is called the Hadean. Its name comes from Hades, the ancient Greek underworld, and it reflects the traditional picture of early Earth as an intensely hostile place. There was good reason for that image. Earth formed through collisions between smaller planetary bodies. One enormous collision is widely thought to have produced the Moon. Large impacts can release enough energy to melt vast quantities of crust and mantle. Models of planetary accretion show that giant collisions were capable of producing enormous magma systems during Earth's formation. But there is a major difference between saying early Earth experienced huge impacts and saying its surface continued to suffer an intense bombardment hundreds of millions of years later. One influential idea is the Late Heavy Bombardment. Evidence from lunar samples was historically interpreted to suggest a concentration of enormous impacts around 3.9 billion years ago. If Earth experienced a similar bombardment, the consequences here would have been much more dramatic because Earth is larger and gravitationally attracts more impactors. Large asteroids striking continental crust can excavate craters hundreds of kilometers across and generate extraordinary quantities of molten rock. The melt does not necessarily remain a chaotic pool. In sufficiently large impacts, thousands of cubic kilometers of molten material can accumulate inside a crater and slowly cool. Different minerals crystallize as the melt evolves, creating what geologists call an impact melt sheet. Some researchers therefore proposed an intriguing possibility. Perhaps some of Earth's oldest zircon crystals formed inside these gigantic impact-generated magma bodies. If that were true, the surviving zircon record might contain fingerprints of the bombardment, even though the craters themselves disappeared billions of years ago. The challenge was identifying that fingerprint. A zircon crystal does not contain a label saying asteroid impact. Its chemistry depends on the magma around it. Zircons produced by ordinary igneous processes and zircons produced in impact melts can overlap in many characteristics. So the new team first needed a known impact crater large enough to provide a reference. They turned to Sudbury in Canada. The Sudbury impact structure formed about 1.85 billion years ago after a massive extraterrestrial object struck Earth. The event created a huge body of impact melt that later crystallized into different rocks. Unlike hypothetical Hadean impact structures that have been erased, Sudbury preserves material researchers can sample directly. The team assembled a large chemical dataset of zircon crystals from the Sudbury impact melt sheet and compared them with zircons produced by more conventional igneous processes. The researchers focused on combinations of elements including uranium, ytterbium, thorium, and gadolinium. One chemical ratio by itself could not reliably identify the origin of every grain, but multiple variables together contain patterns. This is where machine learning entered the investigation. The researchers trained a model using known examples. One group consisted of zircons crystallized from Sudbury's impact melt. The other represented zircons from more typical geological magmas. Instead of scientists choosing one simple threshold, the algorithm learned the multidimensional chemical differences separating the groups. Think of identifying animals from footprints. One measurement, such as footprint length, might not distinguish a wolf from a large dog. Add width, spacing, claw shape, and walking pattern, and classification becomes much more reliable. The zircon model worked in the same general way. Once trained, it could be given ancient zircons whose original rocks had long since disappeared. These are known as detrital zircons. They were eroded from their original rocks, transported elsewhere, and incorporated into younger sediments. Their current location, therefore, does not tell researchers exactly where or how they originally crystallized, but their internal chemistry may preserve clues. The team examined zircon populations from 3 localities older than 3.2 billion years. If giant continental impact melt sheets were an important source of early zircons, researchers expected at least some ancient grains to resemble the known Sudbury impact population. They did not. The machine learning results showed that the ancient zircon populations were inconsistent with crystallization directly from Sudbury-like continental impact melt sheets. The absence is the discovery. Scientists did not find a crater. They did not discover a new ancient continent. They found that a predicted chemical signal was missing from some of the oldest mineral evidence remaining on Earth, and that missing signal places pressure on one interpretation of early Earth. If the Hadean surface was repeatedly covered by enormous continental impact melt sheets, those environments might be expected to contribute zircons to the surviving detrital record. Yet the researchers found no evidence for that source in the populations they tested. They interpret the result as providing no support for a strong late heavy bombardment signature in these ancient terrestrial zircons. That does not mean asteroids stopped hitting Earth. Impacts absolutely occurred. Nor does this study prove that there was no increase in impacts at any point during the Hadean. The evidence is more specific. The researchers tested whether selected ancient zircon populations appear to have crystallized in large impact melt sheets generated by impacts into continental crust. Their results say no. Other impact environments could potentially produce different signals. The surviving zircon record is incomplete, and ancient grains represent only fragments of early Earth. The paper, therefore, does not erase the violent history of the young planet. It changes the balance of evidence, and that has consequences for one of the biggest questions in Earth science. When could Earth first have supported life? If gigantic impacts repeatedly melted large areas of crust, vaporized ocean water, and devastated surface environments, stable habitats might have been repeatedly destroyed. But if the later Hadean experienced fewer gigantic continental impacts than the most extreme bombardment scenarios suggest, long-lived environments could have existed between collisions. Oceans could persist. Hydrothermal systems could operate. Water could interact with crust for extended periods. And chemical systems relevant to the origin of life could have had more time to develop. This possibility fits with other zircon research suggesting that the earliest Earth was more complex than the simple image of a permanently molten inferno. Ancient zircons have previously been used to investigate early crust, water-rock interaction, oxidation, and possible early tectonic processes. The tiny crystals increasingly portray a planet that may have developed recognizable geological environments surprisingly early. The new result adds another piece. Instead of asking what the zircons contain, scientists ask what should be present but is not. This is powerful because early Earth leaves almost no direct landscape behind. No Hadean mountain range remains intact. No 4-billion-year-old river can be visited. Most ancient impact craters have disappeared through tectonics, erosion, and recycling. Researchers are reconstructing an entire planet from surviving microscopic evidence. Machine learning now gives them another way to extract information from that evidence. The method may also be useful beyond this particular question. If chemical fingerprints can reliably distinguish zircons formed in different geological environments, scientists could apply similar classification approaches to ancient crystals whose source rocks no longer exist. Every zircon could become a fragment of a destroyed geological archive. But there is an important reason not to turn this study into a story that says scientists proved early Earth was peaceful. It was not. Earth had recently survived planetary-scale collisions. Volcanism was intense. The atmosphere differed dramatically from today. The young sun behaved differently. Large asteroid impacts still occurred. Habitability does not mean comfortable. It means that some environments may have remained physically and chemically stable enough for liquid water and potentially prebiotic chemistry to persist. The distinction matters. Life does not require an entire planet to be calm. It requires suitable environments to survive long enough. A hydrothermal system beneath the ocean could remain habitable while other regions experience catastrophe. Protected bodies of water could survive events that sterilized exposed surfaces. Microbial life, if it had already appeared, would not need every continent to remain untouched. The frequency and scale of impacts therefore become critical. One enormous collision every few million years produces a very different world from repeated globally devastating events. The zircons cannot yet tell scientists exactly how many asteroids struck Earth, but the missing impact melt signature suggests that giant continental melt sheets were not a dominant source of the ancient zircon populations examined by the researchers. More samples could strengthen or challenge that conclusion. Early Earth zircons are rare, and many are found as isolated grains transported far from their original sources. Future work could expand the training data sets, examine additional ancient populations, and test whether different types of impacts create distinguishable chemical fingerprints. For now, the study has changed the investigation in an unusual way. Scientists went looking for evidence of destruction. They trained an algorithm using crystals from one of the largest preserved impact structures on Earth. Then they asked ancient minerals whether the same signature existed billions of years earlier. The answer was silence. And on the early Earth, that silence may be important. The Hadean may still have been violent, alien, and dangerous, but it may not have been continuously sterilized by the enormous continental impacts once imagined. Somewhere between the collisions, oceans and crust may have remained stable for surprisingly long periods. And if the earliest chemistry of life was already beginning, those quiet intervals could have made all the difference.